everybody, it's AJ, aka the Mighty Glue Stick. How's it going? Welcome to the Mighty Glue Stick channel. And today I'm going to be talking about skeletons. Pretty simple on the outside, and you'd think they're very simple, but you know me, I'm going to give you some extra depth and things to think about with skeletons, so here we go. So, what is a skeleton? A skeleton is a body that's long dead. There's nothing that remains of the original person left in an undead skeleton. It is a undead spirit, a negative energy spirit, a dark spirit, which has inhabited the mortal remains of a creature and brought it back to a semblance of life. It's animated it like a suit that it's wearing. So they say here that whenever a sinister force awakens a skeleton, it infuses its bones with dark vitality, adhering joint to joint and reassembling dismantled limbs. This energy motivates a skeleton to move and think in a rudimentary fashion. So there is no requirement for musculature to move the skeleton. It is moving through dark energy alone. This means that it doesn't have any semblance of biological life at all. Not even a little bit, and it doesn't need muscle and sinew and things to keep functioning, and if you smash its limbs off, it can reattach them through its necromantic force. It can pick up its arm and stick it back on, and it will adhere with that negative energy. Now, the question remains, what is this dark energy? What is this spiritual force, this entity which inhabits the skeleton in the first place? Well, I got an answer for that. If you look at the monster listings for the Shadow or the Wraith, that says that these two dark spiritual creatures are both vulnerable to sunlight. Now, skeletons are not vulnerable to sunlight. So by inhabiting a skeleton, it weakens itself in a certain regard, but it also strengthens itself to be able to move around protected from the vital energy of the sun. So you could say that when you destroy a skeleton, it releases the dark spirit, be it a shadow or a wraith, back into the world, but it can't immediately attack you because it's significantly weakened and shaken up by this whole process, because it needs a lot of its energy to motivate and move around that skeletal body in the first place. So this explains why if in an area of heavy concentration of necromantic energy, of negative energy, of entropic energy, or necrosis, so dark, horrific places, these shadowy creatures are around. So shadows and wraiths and things will seep into the world through the cracks of reality, coming up from dark places and inhabit these festering swamps or old battlefields and things, and they will infuse themselves into the body of an ancient dead or recently slain person and animate the bones, and up it gets, and it moves around as if it's wearing a suit of armor. So this explains why they can spontaneously rise from the ground, and if they see the opportunity to grab a body and raise it in this way, they will, because it just makes sense that they can move around during the daylight hours. So this also explains why they have a semblance of motivation and intelligence of their own. So they have, on average, an intelligence of 6 and a wisdom of 8. I don't know why they gave the warhorse skeleton less of an intelligence and the same amount of wisdom. I would just ignore that. I think that was a mistake on Wizards of the Coast part, because they've sort of forgotten that it's not actually a horse mind. It's an alien entity. It's a spirit which is raising this thing, not the original horse. So a skeletal horse is probably just going to have an intelligence of 6 as well. So this means that they can use whatever they find on this body, and they can also be equipped with things as well, like weapons and armor and stuff. And they will make use of those as best they can. They'll also realize that they don't necessarily want to break their body by smashing through a door or something like that. They'll go around and find a window or something to get in there. They can also use basic animal cunning and tactics. For instance, they could collapse onto the ground and look like a pile of bones, and then when the heavily armed guards and things move past, they'll reassemble themselves, get up, and move off, looking for easy victims. They are, of course, undead creatures and therefore motivated to kill the living. And they will do this whenever they possibly can, and if they're not under the control of a necromancer. If they are raised by a spellcaster or a necromancer, they are under the control of that spellcaster or necromancer because of the bounds of that enchantment. So they are obedient servants, and they follow the letter of what the person tells them to do, and they can't really reason out anything very much more complicated than what they're told to do. But they can be instructed to use siege engines and things like that. They can be turned into siege engines. They can be made out of all sorts of body parts, if this is actually what's going on. So you could say that a wild skeleton that's just sort of raised up in an undead rich area is just going to grab the nearest intact body it can find, or bits of that body, and raise it up as best it can. Whereas a necromancer working on some sort of sick project can raise all sorts of hell by constructing bone constructions, because they don't need any sort of part of the living spirit of the whatever that entity was. The bones are just a medium that they're creating, so they can create all sorts of stuff and make them look very impressive indeed. You can see here I've got a range of images of just this sort of thing where they made them look like grim reapers or multi-headed floating beasts of some kind, or you can use all sorts of different eldritch energies which they've infused into them to give them different versions, like flaming skeletons, a pretty famous example. Or a dust skeleton, or a flayed skeleton, that sort of thing, the dried out, mummified ones. And you can see they have weapons grafted directly onto them. That's no problem at all. So you can use skeletons in all sorts of ways that are very clever. As I mentioned earlier on, liches will use skeletons willy-nilly, however they see fit, and they can take victims that they've slain previously and trap their souls in the mortal realm, and then infuse them into skeletons whenever they see fit. They just have that power to do that. And of course, these spirits, of course, may have some sort of remembrance of past service or other sort of thing. So imagine that the skeleton is just a temporary entity that this thing has raised, and it lives on after the skeleton has been destroyed. So you could be facing the same entity coming back at you and back at you and back at you again, not realizing that you're not actually fully destroying the spirit that raises this thing. Oh, here's a great example of a baby skeleton. How creepy is that? Oh man, that would freak me out. Here's an example of a multi-armed skeleton. You see this in Voyage of Sinbad, I think. There's that sort of thing. This one's got dinosaur bones, which is fantastic. So they don't have to be fresh bones at all. They could even be some sort of fossilized bone. This is a behir that's been raised up as a skeleton. Now it's a scary prospect because those things are wicked at the best of times. Yeah, so you can raise up all sorts of different creatures, and their stats will modify to suit their physical form. For instance, the Minotaur has a charging attack, and it's got a slightly lower armor class because it's larger, but it's got more hit points. And of course, one important difference between the skeleton and the zombie, for instance, is that the skeleton can move at full speed, and they can do so tirelessly, like as long as they want. So being chased down by a pack of skeletons is a very scary prospect, because they can run as fast as you can, and they can do it forever. So they will easily tire you out eventually. And the old adage of the speed of the dead, well, yeah. So imagine that a lich or something like that has got a carriage made up of skeletons that literally the bones of skeletons are charging through the wilderness, and built into some sort of eldritch carriage. Here we have a skeleton of a giant, which is a scary prospect also. And you can also have those modified as well, so that they've got multiple limbs and things like that, creating some sort of gigantic bone golem, because there's really not much of a difference to the spirit which is raising this thing. Here's a skeleton that looks very much like a giant mummy, or maybe it is a mummy actually, a giant. There's no reason why a giant couldn't be turned into a mummy. Here's some purple worms or some such that have been raised up by... That's an awful lot of purple worms. I hope that isn't in the mortal plane. Raised up by a very ambitious necromancer there. So you can imagine there's all sorts of possibilities with skeletons, and they are, as I say, the bodies, the suits, the power armor suits that otherwise vulnerable to sunlight, dark energy spirits, poltergeists, wraiths, shadows, those sort of things will inhabit skeletal bodies to move around and be more effective in the sunlight. And it's actually a lot easier for them to kill living creatures. Here we have a cabal of necromancers who are raising up or constructing a skeleton of gigantic proportions. And as you imagine, they're not the most capable engineers, so it'll probably take them a while. And this is just a weird monstrosity that probably throttles things. And of course, the inevitable army of skeletons, massive hordes of the things. They've only got a challenge rating of a quarter, so yeah, no problem. There's a skeletal siege engine of some kind. Yeah, so obviously they're invulnerable to poison and things like that. They are vulnerable to bludgeoning damage, and yeah, I'll leave you with this lovely image of a skeletal unicorn because, ooh,